You are listening to the Lechatchila Riber podcast.
מי מחזיק את האמת ביד ומי מחליט שהוא רק הנכון והצודק? מי נתן לנו את הבחירה לחיות ולהיות בצד שמחפש אמת?
Welcome to another episode of the Lechatchila Riber podcast. This is Chaim Kozliner. I'm your host. We have here a very special guest with us. He is a husband, a father of 5 children, an author of a new book, and a coach based out of Crown Heights. I'm very excited to be here. He has a wonderful story over here. Very, very fascinating, crazy story. We're going to jump right in to hear. First, let's start from where you're from, Yankel.
I am from a place called Oceanside, New York, not too far away from Crown Heights.
Uh-huh. Now, how was it like growing up? What was your Jewish, religious affiliation?
So I grew up in a conservative synagogue. We celebrated Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Pesach, pretty much. And Hanukkah too. And the extent of my Judaism really was whatever they told me to do in Hebrew school, and that was about it. I wasn't all that interested growing up in anything that had to do with Yiddishkeit.
Uh-huh. How was Gashmi's going? How's it going growing up? How was it like in school? High school?
Yeah, we were middle class. My father and my mother both worked. They did well for themselves, thank God. The high school that I went to, or the schools that I went to, were a mix, about 50-50 of Yidden and not Yidden. That didn't really play too much of a role, all that much, although most of the friends that I grew up with were Jewish, just because that's who my parents told me to associate with. It was Oceanside is a nice place from the outside until you start to get into it and you realize what it's really all about.
So I know you had a lot of kind of jobs. I want to let's get into what were your previous jobs, starting for the first one.
The first job I ever had, I was a camp counselor at a place called Coleman Country Day Camp. I really enjoyed that job. It was really nice. I think I worked with boys who were maybe in second grade. That makes them 7 years old or about. That was very nice. I enjoyed being around children. I really liked it. After that, I worked in catering. I was a waiter in a catering job at a country club. After that, I worked in Starbucks. I was the guy who takes your order from the drive-thru. It was kind of a kiddush at the time. There weren't too many Starbucks drive-thrus. And should I count my other job as my job? I'm not really sure. It's not really a job exactly, but running a massive illegal drug empire was also one of my jobs.
Wow. Tell us more about that. How'd you get into it? What was
Well, here's the thing. Drugs are expensive. And when you're 14 years old and you have no income, you have to find a way to be able to afford your habits. And since I have a pretty good business head, I realized that if I sold it, I would be able to provide myself all that I wanted essentially for free. So I took some of my bar mitzvah money and started up a business. Bought in bulk, you get it cheaper that way, and then you sell small.
So now, why did you need it in the first place? What was the need to have it in the first place?
That's a good question. So for me, I mean, this answer is probably different for most people, but for me, the reason was I was a very small statured kid growing up, like under average height. But I had a big problem where I really like to use my mouth to put people in their place. And most people don't really appreciate that or like that. So the way that they would return the favor was, physically speaking. And that to me was a really big depression point, I would say, or cause of my depression, is that I was small and I wasn't really able to defend myself all that well. And it was depressing being in a world where that is like a supreme value. The the secular world really values, machoism and physicality, and the strongest will survive, etc. So if you're not that, then you're basically like a second class citizen. At least this was my experience in that world. So in order to kind of soothe my pain of being in that lower level, I turned to substances that helped me forget or not care, or just be somewhere else, be someone else.
What was the first experience like? What was the first time you had, like, when you realized that was your escape? What was the, like, did it work? What was?
I don't want to be promoting. I don't want to be promoting drugs on here, but
Not that it was.
I mean, here's the thing. Here's the thing. If it didn't work, people wouldn't use it. That's just the way that it is. And the answer to your question is yes, it worked. It did its job very well, almost too well, which is, why I ended up getting in big trouble later on. Because once you figure out that there's a way you can check yourself out, and if you're seeking to check out all the time, then I ended up being more checked out than I was checked in.
Right. So you had to sell that much. You had to make it a full-time like occupation just to afford the drugs you had, or once you had it, it was like you tried to like make it a business. What was like the main focus?
So originally, I did it on the weekends, and I didn't really need all that much. How many times can you? There's only Friday and Saturday. To the opportunities. Pretty much Sunday in the suburbs is like family day. So I didn't need all that much money in the beginning. But when I started to progress into, Mondays, Tuesdays, and any other day that ends in Y, it becomes an expensive habit. And I realized that I can't afford this without either stealing money or working a job, but I was in high school, or making a side hustle out of this. And that became, the more successful I became, the more I realized that this is a very lucrative side hustle, and maybe even not a side hustle anymore.
But did that, like, were you still trying to get your like degree or whatever? Like, were you trying to still function, or like you ready, like at that point you're like just party? What was like your mindset?
I did my best to fly under the radar because I didn't want my parents to know what was going on, because then they would stop my ability to be able to do what I wanted to do. So I tried to show up as much as I could and try to pass the classes while, being on the moon. I did my best. I didn't succeed, but I did my best.
I think you were passing. You feel like you had a goal.
Some of the classes were easier than others. Remedial Spanish is not that hard. English is one of my favorite subjects, so that I could do, with my eyes closed. Science, on the other hand, was a bit more challenging for me, and doing math equations, very difficult. But if I could get a C in math and a C in science and an A in, or a B in the other subjects, I'm okay, fine.
So take us through, what was it like? How high did you get in the ranks of the selling stuff?
So before I turned 16, I was selling strictly marijuana. And there was a high demand for that in my high school. I would say 90% of the kids got high at least on a weekly basis. And, they were all my classmates, more or less. So very lucrative business, as you can imagine. And then I got caught by my parents. And my father is a drug therapist, so he kind of knew what was going on.
Really?
Yeah. And they caught me with a scale and the bags and a pretty large stash. So they realized that something was not right, and they sent me to go get help. After that didn't work, I was in there for 2 years in rehab, trying to, my parents were trying to get me to stop, and I kept screwing up. After I got out of rehab, then I kind of, it came a little bit more serious, and I hired myself a bodyguard so that nobody would mess with me, and started selling weed and cocaine and heroin. And I did pretty well for myself, about $200,000 when I was 18 in cash.
Not bad.
That's a lot of money.
So in the rehab, like, there's no change, like nothing. Like, was there any will to change in the first place, or just your parents wanted you to be there, so you're there? Like, you were stuck there, you were locked. Like, what was like?
My general experience with life is that when people are not willing to change, then it just won't happen. So at that point in time, no, I was not willing to change. I had no interest in it. I was very happy with my full-time checkout.
So you were locked there for 2 years. Like, you were like physically locked, or like what?
So it was a program where I got to go home every day. It was like a school type situation, about an hour away from where I lived. And that was a huge mistake on my parents' part, not putting me in a place where I was locked up, because I had the opportunity to figure out how to beat their drug tests. And, I spent all of my time trying to figure out how it is that I'm going to be able to get high.
Huh. So you left. What? So how do you like leave? Your parents just let you leave? Like, what? At the end of the thing, like, what's?
So
Like, how did they?
I turned 18, and once I turned 18, then they didn't have any legal control over me anymore, so they couldn't keep me there. And I decided that I had enough, and, so long.
Wow. So any dangerous episodes you had with? I'm sure there's like, what was it like to deal? What was like any dangerous situations you got into?
Every situation was a dangerous situation, to be honest. I mean, aside for the natural, every time you do a deal, you're risking, getting locked up, or, that was a real possibility. But aside for that, when you're dealing with shady products, you deal with shady individuals. And so I met lots and lots of people who would be more than happy to put a gun to my head and rob me if they could. That's why I hired a bodyguard.
So how do you know who to hire? How do you? You have to have bodyguards for the bodyguard. How do you?
Well, that was my mistake. I hired the bodyguard because I met him in an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, and we became friends. And for a little while, we were all trying to stay sober. We had like a group of guys, and then one by one, we all started slipping, and I realized that I have here a very powerful person who could potentially make sure that I'm safe. In the end, that didn't work out, because he ended up turning on me, and I needed protection from him. But at the time, it sounded like a good idea.
So he's physically strong. Like, what made him like a bodyguard? He's physically strong.
Aside for his physical features, he was also a well-known Crip, and people did not want to mess with him because of what that would mean for them.
So how did he mess with you? What was the?
Well, unfortunately he became addicted to cocaine and heroin, and despite what I paid him as a weekly salary, I guess you could call it, he wanted more, and he would physically take it from me. I just had went back to the same place that I was at when I was 14 years old, and just little and not able to really fight. And I didn't want to mess with him either. That's why I hired him. But at one point he stabbed me, and it was not, I got punched in the face. I have a fake tooth because of the damage that he did. It was serious, very difficult to get away from. I tried, but that didn't work out too well for me.
You still used him? You still kept on like using him? Like that only like?
I didn't really have a choice once I got like really far in, because if I was to leave, then he would just rob me, and then I would be done for. And if I kept him, then he would rob me, but it was like at a lesser level, so it wasn't as bad. So I kind of took the lesser of two evils.
So at what point did it get out of hand? Like, was this actually what you were like when you were living this life? Was it like a thrill? You felt like why would you want to go that deep? You said before you wanted a business, you wanted to make money, you wanted to saying when you got that serious, what type was the drive? Like, you got that dangerous and you might risk your life. Why was it worth sitting in jail? What would be worth the money?
Well, at that point in time, I didn't really value my life all that much. So I was convinced that I would be dead by the age of 25 anyway. So it didn't seem like a big waste if something were to happen to me. On top of that, $200,000 when you're 18 years old. Have you ever seen $200,000 cash?
No.
It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money, and that's a really big drive. And on top of that, you get high all day, and you don't have to work a regular job making whatever the minimum wage was at that time at Starbucks. So it was really alluring to be able to live that kind of lifestyle. It wasn't really all that great if you really boil it down, because I didn't really have time to party and have relationships with people. I was just selling all night long, all day, all night, phone calls after phone calls after phone calls. But you tell yourself that, once I get to a certain amount, then I'll hire people, I'll slow down, I'll move back, I'll, remove myself from the day-to-day operations type deal. It's just something you tell yourself.
The goal was to always do that. The goal was just to get bigger and bigger.
The goal was to be the king of New York.
So was it the thrill of was it like being a Matthias? Was it like being was it that you wanted like a identity? Like you're like the guy that hooks people up? Was that like the drive for it?
That's definitely part of it. A lot of it has to do with a certain type of lifestyle. I mean, imagine going to the store every day to buy a fresh outfit every single day, and buying a car with cash, and being able to eat whatever you want whenever you want. There's a lot to that. It's a whole lifestyle.
Has there ever been any close calls with the cops? Any chases?
So because of the fact that I hired a bodyguard who was really deep into this, even without me, so I would consider myself to have learned from the best. Like if I was hiring a coach for the drug business, I did well. I never had any encounters with the police. I never got into any kinds of the worst thing that happened was getting a speeding ticket. That's the type of lessons that I learned, that you never want to draw too much attention to yourself in any negative way, because that's how stupid people get caught.
So you said at 25 you thought you'd be dead. Like, what was the why 25, and what's like?
I had a whole life philosophy behind why 25. In my warped mind at the age of 18, and maybe even a little before, I imagined that once you get to 25 years old, then life starts kind of going downhill from there. So I figured, why would I want to experience the downside? I'll just go up and get to the peak, and that'll be that. And then I'll have lived, an exciting, well-lived life, so to speak, But
if you were running your own show anyways, if you're anyways running your own show, why was 25? Like, if you're part of the system, fine. So 25, you're settling down. But if you're anyways doing your own system, what was like?
Yeah, I hear that. It seemed to me like there's no possible way that I would make it past 25 at any rate, because of the lifestyle that I was living, right? Somebody would come and just, end it. That was my assumption. At the time, yeah. If you have very little value to your own life, then yeah, why would I waste it working at it, grinding like a poor person when I could live it up?
Right. Has there ever been any moments that you almost got killed, or almost in a very dangerous situation? Sure.
I mean, I've been to some of the worst ghettos in New York to buy drugs, and then every time you step into one of those neighborhoods, you're putting yourself at risk. I've had shotguns pointed in my face. I've gotten beat up pretty badly a few times. Every day was a risk.
So at what point did you realize what was the rock bottom? What was the that moment that you realized that you gotta change?
So we were living in motel rooms. I would rent a motel for a week at a time, and we would switch it up so that just in case the cops were following us, we would be in a different place the next week. And one night I had been up all night making, sales and whatever. And I decided that I needed a break. I needed to go home. And when I went home, one of the associates that we were with, one of the people who kind of worked for us, was also a mafia hitman. And he was he would kill people for the mafia. And he was really close with my bodyguard. And in that world, the mafia world, heroin is not well received because it makes you it's like a physical addiction. So if you get caught, the police can kind of manipulate you based on your physical cravings to speak to them. So this hitman decided that he was going to rob us in the middle of the night. He went into the motel room where my friend was, where the bodyguard was, and I was not there. And he got my mother's phone number somehow, and he called my mother and told her that your son is in danger. It wasn't a threatening call. It was, okay. I mean, but it was like, take this situation very seriously because your son is in real danger, which I was, because at that point in time, my bodyguard was starting to turn on me and get more aggressive and more violent. And just the day before is when he punched me so hard that my tooth eventually had to be removed. So it had gotten bad. And he told my mother that your son is in very big danger. And she gave me an ultimatum. She said, you can either stay here and not go back there and we'll help you, or you can go there and you can't be around here because it's too dangerous. I have a younger sister and they wanted to, protect her. So I thought about it for a while. And I decided that, anything short of killing my bodyguard, which would have anyway killed my business, I was not going to be able to get out of this. So I decided that I would take my parents up on their offer and they helped me to escape, essentially.
So what was the process like? You sold everything you had? Like, what was like, how you...
No, I just left it all in the hotel. I stopped answering the phone.
The money and the...
Everything. I gave up everything.
Wow.
And I went, my parents put me on a bus upstate New York to my uncle who lived he has a house in the woods. Where nobody knows where I would be at. And I went up there for a few weeks and came back, but I didn't leave the house at all until my father found me a rehab out of state that I could go to. And then when I went to the rehab, my parents have a garage and I was in the back of the car and I lied down on the floor when they pulled out of the garage and they drove me to the airport, and that was that.
Wow. Are they still after you right now, these guys? Like, are they like what's...
So for a long time,
what were you scared of?
What was I scared of?
Yeah, if they had all the money, everything, why are they still trying to reach
you? I could turn on them and rat them out, and then they would be in jail, and that would be very bad for them. So
what do they want to do with you? They want you to come back? They want you to what's
no, they didn't. I don't know what they wanted to do with me. They were after me. I know this because they broke my car window. They came and they came to ring the doorbell of my house. I was under surveillance at that time, which is why I couldn't go outside. What would they have done? I don't know. I'd rather not find out, which is why I left.
So they kept calling you. At what point did it stop? Like,
are
they listening?
Are they listening?
Can we hear this podcast? Are they going to be on the?
Yeah, no, they're not going to listen to this podcast because years later, when I moved back to America, I lived in Israel for a while. I lived in Israel for about 7 years in between these stories. And when I came back to America, I was, of course, a little bit afraid of what, if they're still looking for me, what would happen if they found me. One time I came back for Tishrei and I went to a 7-Eleven and a guy that used to work for me, started calling my name when I went inside. And I was totally freaked out. I tried to ignore him and he's not, maybe he'll just think he made a mistake. It was nighttime, dark outside. I was wearing my kapata and my hat and my beard and everything. And he's calling out my street name. And I was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that he recognized me. So I tried to play it off, but then I didn't want to seem disrespectful because then the first call that he would make would be to whoever. And so when he came in the store and he called my name, I was like, yo, what's up? How are you? How you been? And he's like, what's up with you? You disappeared. And I'm like, well, yeah, I didn't really have much of a choice. So that night I stayed up all night with a samurai sword watching the window just in case anybody was going to come in. that was a very scary time. But anyway, when I came back to America, I was walking to shul on Shabbos, and it's about a 40-minute walk, and I have to cross the whole town, basically. I had to cut across the whole town, and that made me very nervous. But, I figured I'm on my way to shul, I'm going to do a mitzvah, nothing's going to happen to me. So on my way back one day, I passed by the local dry cleaner, and they have a sign in the window with a picture of one of the guys who used to be after me. And it was like for some foundation, like in his honor. And I'm like, what kind of racket did this guy get himself into? Like, what kind of scam is he pulling? And after Shabbos ended, I went on my phone and I looked it up. And it turns out that he had died from an overdose, and it was a foundation in honor of his untimely passing. So that made me very relieved. And then I started to do a little bit more research on some of the other people who were in my circle at that time who would have liked to see me not well. And it turns out that they also had passed away from overdoses. Wow. So currently, everybody that wished me not well is not here anymore.
Like, wow. Until then, your mom is probably like on the lookout.
Every time I went home, I was super on the lookout.
It's crazy. Didn't you get like calls, like I'm saying, like voicemails, or like?
I changed my numbers. I got rid of everything that was the same, so it was all new. But I basically created a new identity.
So now that you don't have your vices, how do you become happy? Let's get into what does the recovery look like?
What does recovery look like? So, recovery today looks like filling the hole that I had inside of me that I felt I needed to use drugs to filling that with a combination of two things. One is love for Hashem, and the second is love for myself. And that became my replacement.
And how do you find that? What was the main tools that you found through recovery?
One of the main tools that I use now, I would say, is davening. That was like, for me, my greatest ability to connect to the Eibishter. And for self-love, that's a different process, but I don't think we have ein kana makim laharik beze, as they say. I don't think we have the time to go into that, but it's a very interesting process of realizing who I really am and what I really am about, and loving that part of myself and amplifying it.
So becoming frum, was that a big part of the recovery? Like
Yes and no, and I'll elaborate. So when I first came into the rooms of the anonymous programs when I was in the rehab, so the very first thing they tell you is to find a God of your understanding. And for me, at that time, I was a big atheist and, essentially not expecting to live past the age of 25. I was 19 years old when I first got into the rooms of recovery. And I started to experiment with this thought process of what could be a God of my understanding. So at the beginning, it would be like the doorknob was the God of my understanding. Why? Because if I don't use the doorknob to open the door, I'll never get anywhere. And so that, for a little while was like, okay, this is a step up from where I was before. And now I'm going to continue on my search for what it is that I really believe in. And I was at a meeting one day, and this old lady, probably, like grandma age with silver hair. I don't think she was Jewish. She was telling the story of Akedas Yitzchak. She didn't call it that, right? She called it the binding of Isaac in English. And as she's telling the story, I'm realizing that, the story has a lot of similarities and parallels to my own story, except that the roles were really reversed, right? So instead of my father sacrificing me, so to speak, like Abraham did with Yitzchak, it was Yitzchak was forcing my father to sacrifice me, kiviyachol. So I started to cry, which is very something that happens only once in a very blue moon. And I realized that I'm running away from who I am. And together with the influence of find the God of your understanding, I realized that the God of my understanding is, the one that I was learning about in Hebrew school. The God who taught me, who they were teaching me about, was the one who took the Jews out of Egypt. Like, this is my Egypt, and I need his help to come out.
The question is, if you wanted freedom, how did becoming from bring you freedom? How did they bring you peace of mind? Was it like Chassidus? Was it Judaism? Was it the culture? If anything, a lot of restrictions. Which part of Judaism brought you back? Like, do you think you found like the answers to self-worth, to being okay with yourself?
Yeah. So first, in order to answer this question, I'll have to give a little bit more background information. So when I was in the rehab and kind of figuring out what Judaism meant to me on my own, I noticed that on Sundays, a particular group of people were going off to their houses of worship. And they were brought there by the rehab and brought back by the rehab. So I kind of made a macha, like, hey, like, they get to go. I also want to go. So they sent me to a Reform synagogue whose average age of the people who were congregants of this synagogue, this was in Boca Raton, Florida, was, Joe Biden and up. And
that's pretty bad.
And I didn't really feel so much at home at this particular place due to the people who were congregating there. I didn't necessarily want to spend my free time with my Bubby and Zadie. So I complained about their choice of place to send me to, and they found me a Chabad rabbi who deals particularly with Jewish people who are in rehab, and he was also in Boca Raton. And so it's a kind of funny story, but the first time that I met him, he told me that somebody's going to pick you up and bring you to my house, and this was for a Friday night meal. So I remember this very distinctly. We were at an ice cream place. The whole rehab went to an ice cream place right before they would take us to a meeting. So instead of this meeting, I'm going to go to Shabbos dinner. And this guy comes over. He's like got a very big beard and covered in tattoos and a Metallica shirt. So I thought for a second, like, this is an assassin who's come to kill me. I could not understand, like, there's no way that this is the rabbi, right? Like, a totally tattooed guy with a Metallica shirt, and he's asking for me by name. Like, I was totally freaked out. But then he explained that he's coming to drive me to the rabbi's house. So I get in the car with him. We smoke a few cigarettes on the way over. We talk. Pretty much the only thing we have in common is that we both smoke the same kind of cigarette. And we made it to the rabbi's house. And when I got there, I had never really had any meaningful interaction with a really religious person. And so when I get in the house, his wife is very welcoming and come in, and his kids are jumping all over, Metallica guy, and like just zero judgment whatsoever. So immediately I felt at home, and now it takes me back to one of my first jobs, which was working with children. And I had a great time interacting with kids. It had been a long time since I had that kind of wholesomeness and purity again in my life, because that's just not some of the things that come up for you while you're selling drugs on the streets, So I had a very warm feeling entering his home. And of course, the cooking was outstanding, and better than anything I was eating at that time. And I came back the next opportunity that they would allow me to come back. And he kept inviting me over. And he would, they would share Divrei Torah, and I remember seeing the Rebbe's picture on the wall. And I had been reading this art scroll Chumash that my father had sent me. And on the bottom of every page, there was this guy named Rashi who kept getting mentioned. Rashi says this, Rashi said that. So when I came to the Shliach's house, I asked, pointing to the Rebbe's picture, is that Rashi? I had no idea, And he told me, well, it's not exactly Rashi, but that's the Rashi of today. Oh. And I just loved coming there. The feeling was just so warm and accepting, and like how many people would have accepted me at that time into their home around their children, and and fed me food and treated me like an equal instead of like a criminal or a patient. And that really meant a lot to me.
Who's the sheikh, by the way?
Rabbi Kessler, Mayor Kessler.
Interesting. So from there you started breaking. That was the main thing. Once you came for the food, started learning and started.
I would say that the main thing that really hooked me was being accepted.
Right.
And the food was a really nice bonus.
No, that was a chatzchila.
Yeah.
What made you start practicing the Yiddishkeit?
So when I was about a week into the rehab, they asked us to do a thought experiment. What would happen if you were to start using again today? And for me, the thought process went something like this. If I got high today, I would probably rob somebody 3 days from now, buy a gun, and then rob some more drug dealers, and then put myself back into business, which would probably end my life. And I realized that that really wasn't who I wanted to be. And so the pain of running away from that, or the desire to run away from that, really had me invest as much as I possibly could into truly understanding what it means, the God of your understanding, like really heavily investing in that. What does it mean to love yourself and to be loved by God and love God too? And what does he want from me? And I couldn't think of any real other reason than, I escaped from a very, very dangerous situation. And who other than God could have possibly orchestrated that? And how am I going to repay him? What am I going to make it my mission to do? And once that kind of spark got lit, the only answer I could come up with is like, I have to dedicate myself to him. And if the God that I understand is the God of my father and his father and all the way back to Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, then I got to do what he asked me to do, which is, to live a lifestyle that's in accordance with the tools that he gave us, tools that he gave to Moshe Rabbeinu that have existed in a golden chain till me.
The more you did, the more you saw simcha, the more you felt meaning, and the more
that I took on myself, the more I felt a part of something bigger than myself. So it first started off with just going to the rabbi's house, and then he helped me get a job in a Judaica store, and then I would babysit for other Lubavitcher families in our Kehila, and then on Sundays I would play basketball with the little kids, and we had like a basketball school that I was running for a little while, and tutoring reading on Shabbos, and all kinds of different pieces of a puzzle that I was becoming a part of. And like now it wasn't really just about me, it was much greater than me, it was much bigger.
Did you ever go to yeshiva?
Of course I went to yeshiva. How do you think I could say Avram, Yitzchak, and Yankel?
For how long? So where'd you go?
Okay, so
wow.
After I'd spent about a year living in the Boca community, and at that time I made a deal between me, the rabbi, and my parents, because they really wanted me to go to college. And I really did not want to go to college, but they refused to allow me to go to yeshiva without first having gone to college. They wanted me to go to yeshiva in the summer, and I wanted to go to yeshiva, all out. So we made an agreement. I would go to a community college, and I did that for 2 semesters. And towards the end of the second semester, one of my main rivals, who was another drug dealer in town and had threatened my life before, showed up on campus while I was smoking a cigarette outside. Like a little community college in Boca Raton.
Wow.
Why are you here? And I was totally freaked out when I saw him. And his car was there with the New York plates and everything. Like he drove down there. Like I thought my life is going to end right here on the campus while I'm smoking a cigarette outside waiting to go to my next class. And it happened to be that the guy walked basically right up to me, but walked right past me. And I looked at him in the eye, and he looked at me in the eye, and he even nodded his head a little bit. And he just kept moving. But that was a close enough call for me to be like, okay, I got to get out of here. This is way too close for comfort. I don't know why that just happened, but I got to go. So I told my parents that, I'm not safe here anymore and I really have to leave. And so they I told them, like, there's just no way I'm ever stepping foot on that campus again. It's not going to happen. I want to live and I don't want to die.
You're actually scared of the guy? I'm saying, like, the guy was there for you. Like, what do you think?
I don't know what he was there for. I have no idea. I didn't ask him. I just let him walk right past me. I was very happy that he walked right past me. I got in my car. I forgot about my next class and I just drove home. Kept a lookout outside the window because I was afraid of what was going to happen. And after that, and I told my parents I'm not going back, I started to look for a yeshiva that I can go to. I was 19 and a half at the time, maybe 20, I guess. And I tried to get into Mayanot, but unfortunately they had a very strict 21 and over rule. And I somehow found a yeshiva in Kfar Chabad for Americans. I applied, they accepted me. They said, how fast can you get here? And I was very soon after on a plane. So I spent 2 years in yeshiva in Kfar Chabad, the middle of nowhere.
What's it called? It's like a regular yeshiva? It's called Jewish yeshiva? What's it? American? Like Israeli? What kind of?
It was called Or Tamimim. It was a program set up by the Rebbe and run by Rabbi Gafni Shlita and Rabbi Bolton Shlita. They were both appointed. And it was downstairs from the main yeshiva in Kfar Chabad.
And you went to other yeshivas, like in America?
There was a time where I wanted to leave the yeshiva in Kfar Chabad because I didn't feel like I fit in well with the people who were there. They were more from birth homes, kind of on their way out of Judaism, and we were, there were like 5 Balchuvas who were on our way up, and we kind of clashed a little bit, like when they would play 50 Cent in the dorm, and like that really bothered me, and I was, on fire. Balchuva, if you're watching this and I offended you at that time, I'm very sorry. I was immature. Please forgive me. But anyway, I wanted to leave. And I came to America to see, what other yeshivas I could possibly go to. And at that time, there was Seagate, there was Morristown, and there was Hadar Tera. And so I checked out Hadar Tera, I checked out Seagate. I didn't really feel like they were great fits for me. I ended up by Ishkacha Pratis by the oil one day. I got lost driving and I found Francis Lewis Boulevard and I took a right like the Baal Shem Tov says, and I just kept going and going and going until there was no more road left, and all of a sudden I'm at the oil. So I went inside, I wrote a letter I put into the Igris, and the Rebbe's answer to me at that time was, I'm really not very happy with the boys who are from Israel that come to learn in America. They don't have any system of support here in America, and they should stay in Israel. So I went back to Kfar Chabad. And that's where I stayed until I got married.
Thank you for listening to the Lechatchila Adira podcast. Subscribe to us on YouTube and leave us a follow on Spotify. If you enjoyed this episode, please smash that like button and leave us a 5-star review, and stay tuned to part 2 of this interview.